Progressive reformers sought to clean up big business and the government in a variety of ways, including through the adoption of more amendments to the Constitution. The 16th Amendment, which made it legal to graduate the income tax based on a person's income, was added in 1909. And the 17th Amendment attempted to make elections more fair by instituting the direct election of senators, rather than by state legislatures, which could be controlled by political bosses, in 1913. Other political reforms sought to give citizens more direct control over their governments by instituting the initiative and the referendum, which let citizens put proposed laws on a ballot without needing support from their legislators. Reformers also sought to streamline government via the short ballot, which was intended to increase government accountability and clarity, and public utility commissions sought to stabilize the pricing of city gas and water supplies, streetcar fares, and railroad shipping, while zoning boards and city planning commissions sought to clean up slums, improve polluted water supplies, and bring order to chaotic land markets. Other reformers focused on preventing the spread of venereal diseases, stopping prostitution, and taking other measures for public health and morality. Among these, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, led efforts to promote temperance, or abstaining from alcohol, and discouraging premarital sex. Temperance and prohibition were causes taken up by a great number of progressive reformers, who saw alcohol as an evil that spawned a variety of other issues like domestic violence and poverty. These activists, known as the Dries, helped set the stage for various states to pass legislation banning the sale, possession, or transport of alcohol. In 1907, Georgia and Alabama were the first states to go dry, followed by Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. By 1917, 2/3 of the states had some form of prohibition laws, and roughly 3/4 of the population lived in dry areas. With the passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, which kicked off the era of alcohol prohibition in the U.S., this patchwork was given federal support. Not all reform projects were undertaken by middle-class white people. The Progressive era also saw black communities in the segregated South take up reform projects, like improving schools, seeking out larger shares of state budgets, engaging in legal action to secure equal rights, and environmental efforts. At the same time, however, the country was deep in a period known as the nadir of race relations, which brought some of the worst racial violence and racist policies into being. During this time, African Americans lost access to many of the rights improvements they had gained during the Reconstruction period. Violence, lynchings, segregation, and legalized racial discrimination all proliferated. In reaction, African Americans began increasingly to move north, in a period known as the Great Migration. Many of those who migrated moved to northern cities such as New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. They still faced serious hostility, as well as segregation and widespread racism. In the Midwest and West, many places were known as sundown towns, which promised African Americans that they would face violence if they remained there overnight. When President Woodrow Wilson was voted into office in 1912, he made new efforts to segregate the federal government's facilities. The 1915 film Birth of a Nation celebrated the original Ku Klux Klan and is credited with bringing the Klan back into power in the 1920s. More power, in fact, than it had ever had before. By 1924, the Klan had 4 million members and significant influence over the governments of several southern and western states. Mob violence against African Americans was widespread. 36 cities across the U.S. saw white supremacist violence in the summer of 1919, which became known as the Red Summer. White mobs murdered at least 43 black men that year, but a report delivered to President Wilson indicated that the states were unwilling to take any action to prosecute the murders. Many former black soldiers who had returned from deployment in World War I were angered and frustrated by these conditions after having fought for their country. From a progressive reform perspective, many people felt that race relation problems actually stemmed from a society that was being integrated, and reformers fought for increased segregation. Between 1895 and 1910, progressives in southern states helped deny black people the right to vote by popularizing the Grandfather Clause, which restricted voting rights to men who were allowed to vote or whose male ancestors were allowed to vote before 1867. This disenfranchised black voters because the 15th Amendment, which provided them the right to vote, was not passed until 1870. The Supreme Court declared the Grandfather Clause unconstitutional in 1915, but its use persisted. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the 15th Amendment was enforceable. As the black vote was being forced out, voting power for white women was on its way in. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union advocated for women's suffrage, while they worked on other issues like prohibition. In addition to sexist attitudes of the time, some opposed female suffrage because they feared the women's vote would tip the scales on issues they were against, such as eliminating child labor and prohibiting alcohol, and increase the share of socialists in the voting pool. In 1916, Alice Paul formed the National Women's Party, which was focused on getting women the right to vote nationally. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, to replace the men who left to fight, women moved into workplaces that traditionally were closed to them. The 19th Amendment, which prohibited discrimination in voting on the basis of sex, was adopted on August 18, 1920. The U.S. sought to be a world leader in other areas. The quest for an explorer to reach the North Pole, considered the last unexplored area of the Northern Hemisphere, inspired competition between British, Norwegian, and American teams. Numerous journeys were attempted. In 1909, the New York Times announced that explorer and former U.S. Navy commander Robert Peary had successfully reached the North Pole. But his victory was marred by another American explorer, Frederick Cook, who claimed he had visited the pole a year earlier. The competing claims drew significant controversy, with people unsure of who to credit with the victory. Newspapers polled their readers on which explorer they thought had been victorious. In January 1911, Peary appeared before a subcommittee of the House of Representatives to defend his claim, which narrowly voted for Peary to receive recognition for the feat. The Bill of Recognition that was signed into law by President William Howard Taft, however, did not credit Peary with the North Pole's discovery, but rather more generally lauded him for his Arctic exploration. The question remains today whether Cook or Peary ever made it to the pole. In 1904, the U.S. took over efforts from the French to build a canal that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through a 50-mile stretch of Panama. The idea of a Panama Canal dated back to the earliest explorers of the Americans, who realized it would be a useful shortcut between Europe and Eastern Asia. Under direction from President Roosevelt, the U.S. fought back mosquito-borne illnesses, stubbornly excavated through the local mountain range, and devised a system of locks and dams that would move boats across uneven water levels. The canal officially opened on August 15, 1914, and at the time was the most expensive project in U.S. history, costing the U.S. government around $375 million at the time. Added to its cost is the human toll. Thousands of workers died during its construction, but good records were not kept. At least 5,600 workers were listed as having been killed between 1904 and 1913, but this is thought to be a significant undercount. The construction of the Panama Canal proved to be a critical boost to global trade routes for the 20th century. It would later be recognized as one of the marvels of the modern world. It was one of the progressive era's most notable technological achievements. As European countries took sides in the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson declared the United States was going to remain neutral in what was then being called the Great War. However, after a German submarine sank the British ocean liner Lusitania in 1915, killing over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans, public opinion on U.S. involvement began to change. In 1917, the British intercepted a coded message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann, to the German minister in Mexico proposing an alliance between the countries to take back Mexican territory if the US were to enter the war on the side of the Allies. Public outcry against this plan, as well as against the ongoing German submarine attacks on non-military vessels, led Wilson to ask Congress to declare war on Germany. Congress agreed on April 6, 1917, and soon passed the Selective Service Act, instituting the first draft since the Civil War, leading about 2.8 million men to be drafted alongside another 2 million who joined the military voluntarily. German Americans were required to register themselves with the government, and thousands were arrested and interrogated. Some were interned for the duration of the war in 2 prisoners of war camps located in Georgia and Utah. At first, the home front was relatively unprepared to support the war effort. The entire economy and U.S. population needed to help keep the money, soldiers, food, supplies, and munitions flowing. The federal government created many new agencies to help the economy pivot to support the war effort and to produce propaganda. A week after declaring war on Germany, Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, a bureau dedicated to creating pro-war propaganda. Using photographs, movies, rallies, scripted speeches, press reports, and public meetings, the CPI fostered American patriotism and stoked anti-German sentiment. With the passage of the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, criticism of the government or the war effort was essentially outlawed. A particular focus was put on children and youth organizations, who were expected to teach patriotism and to help encourage support for the war. The U.S. Food Administration instructed the American public to economize their food budgets and grow what were known as victory gardens in their backyards to feed their families. A constitutional amendment applied an income tax to high earners, and businesses faced other new taxes on their excess profits, which all helped fund the war. Most new funding, however, came from the sale of war bonds. Many women began working in traditionally male professions to assist the war effort, such as on assembly lines making munitions. Others worked for the military as support personnel or nurses stateside and overseas. The Army Signal Corps employed female switchboard operators to help with communication along the Western Front. These women were highly trained and bilingual in English and French, but because the War Department forbade women except as nurses in hospitals, they were hired only reluctantly. Ultimately, women were accepted in order to free up more men for the front.